Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I know people are still trickling in, but I appreciate you all being here and spending some time with me. Um, so, we're going to be talking a little bit about gathering feedback and, more importantly, using that feedback. But I would love to know who is in this virtual space with me. I'm going to introduce myself, and while I'm doing that, if you can go ahead and introduce yourself with your name, your organization, and where you're located. My name is Heidi O'Neill. I'm the Senior Coordinator of Partner Services here at Listen for Good. My role is really just to be a liaison to nonprofits and to organizations as they are learning about feedback and but also whenever they're interested in learning about Listen for Good in particular. I'm located right outside of Los Angeles. I'm actually in Glendale. Um, I can be specific because I know this is mostly a California crowd. So yeah, if you can go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat, I'd love to get an idea of who's here. We're getting pretty good turnout already. So while you all hi Renee, it's so great to see people. Okay, I'm gonna encourage you to use the chat to introduce yourselves, but we're also going to start using the chat because I want to get to know a little bit about you all. So, my first question for you is, have you recently tried to gather input from your community? And I want you to define community in any way that makes sense for you. So, they could be clients, they could be community members broadly, they could be staff, they could be volunteers, but any audience that you wanted to hear from. How did you find that process? If you think back to that most recent experience, was it a good process? If it was, on a scale of 1 to 5, one being it was a frustrating process, five being it was an excellent process, you got great feedback, you got great detail, you got effective data that you were able to use, that would be a 5. So on a scale of 1 to 5, um, how would you find how would you find that experience? I'm seeing a 3, more threes. I'm going to give you all a moment to think about this one and to continue introducing yourself. If you haven't done that yet. So let me share that I often hear from well, I do this regularly. I ask this question to nonprofits all the time, and typically I hear a lot of 2s and 3s. Sometimes I see some 4s. I've even seen a 5, but the typical nonprofit will rate themselves either a 2 or a 3. So if you feel like that's where you are, let me just share that you are very normal. I'm also interested. I'm going to continue. I want to encourage you to continue putting in your introduction if you haven't done that. Put in your scale of 1 to 5 question. But I'm also curious. You can add this to your response. When we promoted this, we talked about different audiences, and I'm interested in knowing what is the audience that feels most salient to you. Is it volunteers? Is it hearing from partner organizations? Is it hearing from staff? Is it hearing from the broader community? Is it clients? So who is it? What are the audience? You can say more than one, but what are the audiences that really feel important for you to gather feedback from? And thank you all for continuing to be in the chat and to engage. This is really helpful. But also, I think it's also nice for your colleagues to see these responses. While you all do this, let me give you some background. Let me give you some information on what we're going to be talking about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why it's important to listen broadly. Most of the time, I talk about why it's so important to listen to clients. And in fact, if you want to hear the whole Listen for Good spiel on why client feedback is really effective, we actually did a presentation with the legal aid with this audience last year on clients. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about clients, but I'm going to be talking a lot more about other audiences here and how you can tailor the best practices from Listen for Good to those different audiences. Basically, I'm going to make the case that the skills that you use when you're doing client feedback can be really well transfer really well to those other audiences. And I'm going to spend just a very, very short amount of time talking about like what is Listen for Good? How do we partner with organizations? I'm seeing a lot of people who are interested in hearing from clients, also volunteers and community is coming up. Linda says all of these, so thank you for sharing your approach. I'm going to talk a little bit about how different organizations um, use this feedback from different audiences. And I want to start with actual volunteers because I know that volunteers are um, a big part of, for a lot of legal aid organizations, your volunteer attorneys and clinicians, they're not an optional part of the work that you do. They're really central to how many clients you can serve. And like any relationship, it works better when there's communication going in both directions. And so when we ask volunteers about their experiences, um, we're able to know, what the organization does that supports them well, what could be clearer, what could be easier, what would make them more likely to stay engaged. Um, and also, what would be make them more likely to recommend this opportunity to a colleague, right? So that's how we get information that's really useful for planning. It's useful for organizational decision making. It's useful for strategic planning. So it's really not just about measuring satisfaction for its own sake. It's really about what sustains these relationships over time so that we can make really deliberate decisions to strengthen them, right? We know that these relationships are really important. So I'm curious, right? If you when you're thinking about, those of you who work with volunteers, how do you know what makes them come back? This is kind of a bigger question to think about. If you want to share it in the chat, I would absolutely love to see those responses, but I share this more as something to ponder, something for you to think about. And I want to share the example of one organization that we worked with that, sorry, I was just checking the chat. One of the organizations that we worked with, and this is one of the few examples that I'm actually able to give that's focused on a like a public safety organization. This is an organization that provides um, they provide mentorship and they provide support to the families of incarcerated individuals through programming that includes a mentorship program. And this is a pretty unique example because what makes their approach unique is they designed a single survey to be taken by both clients and their volunteers. And this was really planned mostly for logistical reasons. This organization was going through a lot of staff turnover and they really needed to focus their staff's capacity and get the most out of a single survey. And so they asked both groups, volunteers and the people they served, the same core questions. And this really let them see where their experiences aligned and where they diverged. So both groups named emotional support as the organization's strongest quality, which was really meaningful for them to document, particularly given that this organization um, was having such high turnover and such challenges with staffing. And the fact that both organizations, that the quality really held across both audiences, really, I think, indicates something important about the culture of the work itself. And that's one of those things that's kind of easy to dismiss, right? That people feel emotionally supported, because that can be a hard thing to create, but that's a really critical part of this work, right? I think a lot of you can actually probably understand that. And when they were looking at areas of improvement, communication really came through as the area most in need of attention. And when the team saw that finding alongside some of the context of these recent staff transition, it really helped them understand the connection between what was happening internally and what was being felt externally, right? They could see that the impact of staff transitions was having an impact on their clients and on their community, but it really gave it a concrete form, right? We can probably make guesses that that's happening, but this was really able to validate that work. It also made something else, um, it made something else very visible and very clear to the organization, which again, you can assume, you can kind of know, but you can't always validate. They what this validated was that who was volunteering didn't reflect the families that they served. Mostly when it came to the gender of their family members and of their mentors. So 85% of their caregivers were women, while 25% of their mentors were. So seeing that gap documented, really rather than like informally understood, it gave the organization something concrete to point to when they were having conversations about program design and recruitment. So I want to note here what this shows is really what good data can surface. Right? There's the harder work. So, understanding is really important. That's the first step. But the harder work is really deciding what to do with with these findings and building the internal momentum to act. So that's something I want to talk about in a little bit. But this is the one where that's really the step where organizations need the most support. And that's why we talk about this in the context of a full feedback loop and why actually doing something with the data is so critical. So I'm going to come back to this example and really talk about the importance of doing what we do with the data after we understand it. So that's really why we're thinking about volunteers, right? Because we know that the work that they're doing is really so critical to having an impact on our community members. Um, and so having those really understanding those relationships, understanding what motivates those relationships and uh, what what influences someone to return is a really important part of understanding the volunteer experience and ensuring that we can have really strong relationships there. I want to talk about another audience that sometimes we think about. And this one wasn't mentioned, so I'm going to go through it kind of quickly. But for many of our organizations, you're not always the main point of contact for clients, right? So when you're working through partners to serve the people you ultimately care about, your clients and your community, it can kind of sometimes be hard to know if your work is actually landing, right? So you're kind of one step removed from the outcome. And partner surveys help close that gap in a few important ways. First, they really validate what's going on. They validate what's going well. That matters more. And we kind of mentioned this in the volunteer survey. It matters more than it might sound, right? Because your staff really pours energy into these relationships, and having partners explicitly name what's working is a really powerful confirmation that that effort is worthwhile. It's really good for morale. It gives you concrete evidence of impact, even when you can't see it directly. And second, it helps identify where those relationships can be stronger, right? Not necessarily because there's something bad or something is broken, but it does help you know where to improve. It helps keep partners engaged. And it keeps them it's very similar to volunteers. It keeps them coming back because if partners feel unheard or underserved, they often quietly disengage. And so surveys really help us catch that early. And I'm curious, for those of you in in the group here, how many of you are working with partner organizations? I'm going to share an example of one organization um, while you all let me know in the chat how many of you might be working with partner organizations. So this was not when I was creating when I was creating this presentation. A lot of our legal aid organizations are still actually in survey development. So not a lot of my examples, I will say, are legal aid organizations, but I want to talk about them in the question. Um, so the National College, so this is a national college readiness nonprofit. So they work with school partners who are like principals, assistant principals, school counselors, post-secondary counselors, graduation coaches, like a lot of administrators, to understand. So they wanted to understand how that partnership was landing from their side. And what came back was pretty affirming, actually. So partners named high quality programming, they named responsiveness and communication as clear strengths. And when your work happens through other organizations, right, it ultimately benefits people that you never meet directly. And so getting that sort of direct confirmation from partners is meaningful evidence that what you're doing is working. I come from the youth development world where I trained a lot of teachers and administrators on creating safe environments for young people. And, it wasn't often that we got to hear from young people that their environments were improving. But what we knew was that if the teachers knew what they were doing, if the teachers could create safety, could create strong relationships, that ultimately those young people were going to have better experiences. So, that's why really understanding the partner experience is so important. So what I do like to share though, and what was really interesting about this organization and what the data revealed is the range of responses based on the role. And what it really surfaced was that different staff had different needs. And this was one of those things that it can be really hard to understand the patterns through one-on-one conversations. So this was an organization that had a lot of strong one-on-one relationships, but it was through surveying that they were actually able to see this pattern. So standardizing and aggregating responses gives you a much clearer picture of the full range of what their partners are experiencing. So on the growth side, partners wanted more impact data. In fact, there was this great example. One partner asked whether they had data that was showing that this partnership was working. So the same types of things that they were trying to analyze, their partners were interested in that as well. They also wanted, though, some streamlining in communication. They named cost and capacity as real barriers, which I think is something as an organization that works with other nonprofits. That's something that we're always trying to be aware of, like what are the challenges that our partners are going through. But maintaining your understanding of these goals and these pain points is really what keeps that relationship strong. And ultimately, it's what allows us to have the impact on the organizations that we're partnering with, and ultimately the clients that they're working with as well. So that's really why we think about partners as a really important organization to be, really important audience to be surveying. I want to take a moment to talk also about staff and why it's so important to survey and really understand our staff. I know it can seem as a really obvious thing, but they really do help us understand what our teammates are experiencing, especially around things like belonging, connection, and whether they feel like their voice is being heard. And similar to our partner survey, right? These are things that are hard to get a clear picture of through maybe informal check-ins or through one-on-one conversations. And a structured, anonymous survey lets you aggregate that across your whole organization and really understand the patterns that are happening. And so, again, I want to just throw in the chat an idea for you to think of. You can answer it in the chat, but you can also just think about it. When you think about when you think about your staff, what's one thing that you wish you knew about your team's experience, right? What's maybe one thing you wish you understood a little bit better? While you think about that, I'm going to share a brief example of a national nonprofit that supports childcare providers. So they ran an anonymous organizational health survey and they found a real mixed bag in their feedback, which is something that's to be expected in a staff survey. And actually, it's a positive thing when you hear both positives and some critiques because it means that there's some level of trust, right? When people are giving candid feedback, if sometimes it's a concern when we only hear positive feedback that we have some sort of confirmation bias happening. So some of the areas of celebration that they heard, right, were that staff were feeling deeply connected to the mission and that they strongly valued the organization's flexibility and commitment to relationships. And so understanding what your staff values is really useful because those are the things you really want to make sure that you're protecting and you're building on. Positives are not necessarily a time to rest on your laurels. It's those are the things we want to strengthen. But areas on the growth side, staff really wanted more transparency, more professional development. They felt that some organizational changes hadn't been communicated in ways that help them understand the impact. And when you can see these patterns across the whole team, rather than hearing them one on a time, you're really better positioned to really understand, what's systemic versus what's one individual's opinion so that you can better prioritize responses. And this is kind of a theme, right, that you're seeing across all of our audiences. Ultimately, surveys can be really valuable and really helpful because they help us take what maybe we're hearing a little bit of, right? Maybe we're hearing something from one client or from one staff member or from one volunteer, and you wonder, is this something we really need to put effort into, making changes around or put effort into growing? And when we're able to hear a broad base of voices, we're able to either validate that, yeah, this is a pattern, or, sometimes it's just one person's opinion. I also just want to note what this organization did with the results is really important. So they shared findings with leadership first, and then they held a debrief session with the full staff. And it's that process of sharing back and creating space for conversation that makes staff surveys really effective. So with all of these, it's not about collecting the data, it's about what you do with it. And we're going to talk about why that sharing back is so important. Staff surveys in particular are really, really important to close the loop and to come back to, because our staff are going to have the expectation that we're going to do so, and not doing so can actively erode trust. And so really sharing back is going to be a big part of why we do and how we do staff surveying. Again, thank you all so much for putting your responses in the chat. Rachel, I do see your hand up, and I think we have time. Is it okay if we take your question live?
Yeah, that's fine. Um, so I work at a legal aid organization.
Mhm.
We have done a number of staff surveys. They repeatedly show a lot of really positives, and then the one area that is repeatedly really, really low is transparency and internal communication.
Yep.
Um, and we'll have an all-staff meeting, it will be acknowledged, and then nothing changes. We have a union, but ultimately the folks in our upper management repeatedly um, don't inform us of what's going on, don't consult us.
Mm,
Um, how do you have suggestions for how to make leadership actually buy in and implement strategies that will have the effect of communication and transparency?
yeah. Can I tell you, that's a really tough question.
Yeah.
Th I mean, this is right. Isn't this what like every Harvard business consultant is always talking about, like in their leadership? Like, how do we make leadership responsive? Um, so part of that, so the way that Listen for where I can talk about it from the Listen for Good perspective, because I can go on, side quests here. From the Listen for Good perspective, this is this is why we, and I'll talk about this in a moment, why feedback is a five-step loop. And I'll talk about it, but I'm going to give you a quick preview. So the survey development and the collection and the analysis are steps 1 through 3, and that's the part that's easy, right? In many ways, that's the easy part because it is the actually doing something with the data and doing what we call closing the loop. But it sounds like people are closing the loop without actually doing the doing something with the data step. The hard part is that leadership buy-in is just tricky, right? There's no secret to getting leadership to buy into the importance of listening to the data. There's a couple of ways that we think about it from a survey perspective. One is that we often pair those types of questions, the open-ended, what could we do better type questions, and the, where are the areas of improvement questions, with a satisfaction question. So, and I'll talk about what that looks like, but it's the how likely is it that you would recommend, right, working here? Um, and that allows us to track general satisfaction along with specific things. And so it would be one thing if if when you do a survey like that, you can pair maybe lower levels of satisfaction with here are ways to improve it, or you can start having conversations like, here's where our satisfaction is. We would like staff satisfaction to go up. Here is what staff are identifying as ways that we can improve that and build the plan with the goal of we're going to increase that number. So sometimes leadership like those really clear metrics, and when you can tie something like transparency to a satisfaction number, then that will help motivate people. If you have the type of leader who's driven by like numbers, that can be one way to do it. Um, the other thing is when we're transparency can sometimes be a pretty broad thing. Like, what does that mean? And so you could also think about it from a surveying perspective of how do you how do you ask what are the questions maybe that you can ask that um, maybe are a little bit more narrow, right? That are real specific when it comes to like experiences. Like you could ask about like a specific a process, right? Like and I don't know if it's like annual reporting, if or it's around the time that you're doing your annual review, or, around the time that you're doing strategic decision making. Asking about those specific processes might be able to inform some of the questions that you want to ask that will result in data that feels a little bit more actionable, rather than saying we need to improve transparency, saying we need to improve the process around this thing, because this is the area that people are identifying as like where transparency isn't happening, might also help create a few action steps there.
Thank you.
Of course. A bit of a long-winded question. I thought I saw another hand raise. Is it okay if I get through a couple more slides and then we get back to those questions? Because you're asking really good questions and I do want to get to them. So I'm gonna go through a couple more audiences and then we'll get to I promise we'll get to like the nitty-gritty of the how we do this. Um, we're still in the why. So I want to talk about community surveys because community surveys are different for us. These are not just about your current participants, but they're about the people you haven't reached yet. So what do community members actually need? What do they know about your organization? Who's being left out of the conversation? And those are the questions that can really help reshape your strategy, your advocacy, and some of those partnerships. So I'm curious for those of you who are in the virtual room, have you done a community-wide survey before? Yes or no, or maybe it's something you're planning. Because community surveys are really about building trust and building transparency, not with our staff, but with those in the broader community. I'm going to try to go really quickly through these examples because I have a feeling you all are going to be asking really good questions and I want to increase the Q&A time. So this is an example of a food and fitness coalition, Mattapan Food and Fitness Coalition, work on like health and food access and transportation equity. They did a pilot. So I like to talk about the structure of theirs because theirs is really interesting. They did a pilot with a survey about 25 residents using like flyers and QR codes, and that led to them ultimately hearing from about 120 people, which for them is a pretty big community survey. And they learned a couple of both confirming and surprising things, right? They learned that the cost of living and housing concerns were actually the top two things that were concerns for their community members, which are not things that is a part of their direct mission, right? But rather than dismissing that data, they used it as a signal, right? Where should they be advocating? Um, and so when cost of living was something, when affordable housing were identified as important things, they said, okay, this isn't something we work on, but how can we better advocate for our community members in this area? And more importantly, who should we be partnering with? They also found that some of their community members, including older adults, were underrepresented in their outreach. And so that's an important data piece too, right? Because it tells them where their next round of engagement needs to focus. And so, based on what their community members were saying, they formalized their advocacy action items. They created stronger partnerships based on the things that were beyond their direct mission, right? And they really worked on developing this advocacy model with more workshops and more campaigns, realizing that their community members really needed them to be able to speak broadly about what they were experiencing, and that's where they built their response to the community survey. Another really quick example is the uh, Keweenaw Community Foundation. So they heard from their community members what was really because they serve a rural region where the residents have historically felt really excluded by institutions, right? And we felt this was really important context because it really shaped what they were trying to do with this survey. So the goal here was not just to understand their community, but to really start to rebuild trust. So they heard from just over 200 community members, and when they compared this to census data, it mirrored census data really closely, right? So they were able to say that this was a representative sample of their community members, and that's something that's really important when we're doing community surveys, that we want to ensure that we're hearing from a representative sample of our community. Uh, what they learned was that half of respondents didn't even know what a community foundation does. And when you see something like that, that's those are clear bells, right? There's something actionable here to do. So how do right? So yeah, and that's something that without asking people, you wouldn't have known about because having conversations with people isn't, will only surface a little bit of this. What they did with these findings, really important here. And this is a really good example of closing the loop. They published community impact report and they held open house sessions in order to really think about how are they sharing with their broader community. And that process of sharing back is part of what builds trust over time because they also streamlined their grant reporting process in order to really build the relationships with those who knew who they were and those who didn't know who they were. Really, the idea here is that the surveying is not a one-time exercise. It's really the beginning of ongoing relationships, right? So we're really thinking here about how do we build this trust. We talk, this is something we think about with all of our audiences, but it is a critical part, I think, of building trust in our community. And so, really, when we think about this, it's really about how do we hear from, how do we incorporate both client voice, because that's really what Listen4Good started with, but also really meeting the diverse needs of the sector. And so we've developed these templates to help you hear from different audiences. And I want to talk about that a little bit and how this approach really integrates. So what I want to spend a little bit of time on is just sharing how the similarities in the approach between all of these surveys, because I think what it shows is that when you build your muscle in doing a client survey, for example, it's the same muscle you're going to use to hear from your staff. It's the same muscle you're going to use to hear from your community members. And so it's actually quite easy. Quite easy to adapt your skills and your knowledge from one audience to another. So that's helpful, I think, when you think about creating a culture of feedback. And I mentioned the satisfaction question, and this is something that we include in it's in all of our templates, right? It's called the Net Promoter question. This is a really important question that we really recommend always building into your survey. And it's the how likely are you to recommend this question. So for clients, you're asking them about recommending it to someone in a similar situation. For volunteers, you're asking them how would they recommend, how likely is it they would recommend it to a friend. For a partner organization, you're asking about recommending it to a colleague. So really the weight, the scale, the structure, we benchmark these so you can actually compare to similar organization. All of that is the same. And really just what shifts is the relationship that you're asking about. And so this allows you to get really high quality data, right? That you can use. This is a really helpful question. The how likely is that you would recommend. It's a 10-point scale question. And what it does is it really helps you have a benchmark score that you can track over time. You can compare across programs, you can compare across audiences, but it really helps create a standard in all of your feedback. So we always recommend having the how likely is it that you'd recommend question. I will mention though, when we're doing community surveys, this is structured a little bit different than our other templates. Our other templates, we start with the how likely is that you would recommend, but with a community survey, we actually ask first about relationship to the organization. So we ask about current participant, if you're a current participant, a previous participant, if you've never been a participant, and you get different questions based on how you do this, so that you can hear both from those who you've already heard from and those who haven't connected with you before. Again, this gives you a way of understanding some diverse experiences. If you partner with Listen for Good, we have this built in to kind of help you do this. Um, but depending on how you ask those questions, how they answer those first questions, they'll get different questions. But ultimately, it allows you to aggregate this data in some really interesting ways. Some of the other questions we recommend asking is to have some open-ended questions that pair really well actually with the benchmark. And so that what we ask is we ask how what are we good at, right? So we ask clients, what are we good at? We ask volunteers, how well are we doing in supporting volunteers? Staff, we ask what are we doing well as an employer? Partners, we ask what are we doing well as a partner? But the structure of this question really gives people the space to talk really well actually about you, right? They get to say good things about the partnership. And then we also ask what the opposite, right? Where could we improve? Where could we do better? Um, and having those two questions paired with that net promoter score allow you to disaggregate the data in some really actionable ways. Because you can say, who has high satisfaction? What are they identifying as the things that are working really well for them? Who's having lower satisfaction? And what are the things that they're identifying as barriers or challenges? So it's really about the combination of that net promoter score question as well as these open-ended questions that um, allow you to get some really actionable feedback. We're talking about three questions here, and you're already starting to identify some things to do. A couple of other questions we really strongly recommend is asking about, for clients in particular, we ask about needs being met, but when we're working with staff, we ask about voice mattering, right? How often do you feel like your voice matters? And it sounds like some of our organizations maybe wouldn't rank very high when we're asked that question. And then with community, we're asking about their main needs and issues, right? So each of these questions ultimately have a very similar structure, but they're tweaked slightly so that we can really make sense of what is it that someone is looking for in these relationships and in these partnerships. And so you can kind of see again how having some core questions and building out a pretty core survey, we do this through our template, which is available on our website. Having this approach kind of helps you again build this shared muscle that you can then transfer to different audiences. And I often get asked, like, where should we start? Right. And I like to answer this, you can start wherever it makes sense for you. There's really no right answer here. There's a couple of things though I would recommend that you keep in mind. So you can use staff, partner, and volunteer surveys to create buy-in from audiences around doing client surveys or community surveys. And this is, I say this because when a person like a staff member, for example, experiences it first, right, and they get the feeling of what is it like to be heard from? What is it like to be responded to? They're more likely to buy into the process and see how it's helpful, right? They can see what it would be like from the client perspective. And so if staff or volunteers are a part of deploying the survey, it really helps that they've already experienced what it's like to be a part of it, and they can help. They'll more likely be engaged when it comes to surveying other audiences in the future. I'll also note that community surveys are our most complex survey. And so while you can start with a community survey, I actually do recommend completing another loop with another audience because it's easier to build that muscle with an easier survey. Community surveys are a little bit more challenging. I just want to, I kind of said this, but I like to reiterate it. Our surveys are iterative and cyclical, so they build upon each other. And at some point, you're going to do it again. So keeping track of what works and what doesn't will help you in future loops. And I've been talking a lot about loops, and this is where really I think the rubber hits the road. So let's talk about it. So, what is a high quality feedback loop? So, we visualize feedback as a five-step feedback loop. Uh, so first we start with how do you design a survey? How do you design a survey? How do you write questions that are actionable? which means that it'll result in data that you know what to do with it, and that's accessible to the people who are taking the survey. Particularly important when it comes to our client and community surveys. And so the survey really focuses on experiences that people are having. It focuses on their needs. It focuses on their self-reporting really of what they're experiencing. So how do we design a high quality survey is where we start. And then it's all about how are you gathering those responses. So how do you really tailor each data collection method to the context so that you can get a high enough response rate as well as a representative response rate, and so that people will give you candid feedback. Once we have those responses, then it's all about how do we draw insight? How do we understand what's happening? How do we see who's having a positive experience? How do we identify patterns across the data so that we can really understand what's going on and ensure that everybody is having the experience that we want them to have? Once we have this data, this is why we gather it. We gather it so that we can do something with it, so that we can get to step four. We do not believe in feedback for feedback's sake. It is so that we can make course corrections, and really why we do this is so that we can incorporate our community's voice into our decision making. So step four is all about how do you respond to this data. And step five is how do you share back uh, what you heard and what you're doing with your community. I want to share just a couple of tips on going through a full feedback loop. And these are really applicable to any of the audiences. So, when we first think about it, we think about how do we make it accessible? How do we make the survey accessible? And how do we make it engaging? And then, how do we segment the responses so that the insights are actually actionable? And how do we close the loop with clients, but also with community members, with staff, with volunteers, with any audience here? So when we think about creating an accessible and engaging survey, it's really so that we can hear from as many people as possible, and so that it promotes really candid responses. And a lot of the time, when people are thinking about designing their survey and collecting those responses, they're thinking about the technical parts of surveying, right? Are we using a text message? Is it an email? Do we send reminders? Um, is it a paper survey? How do we get the data in? All of that is really important, and those are questions that you need to grapple with. But what we is an underserved idea of the process is the messaging and the framing is really important. And you all oftentimes are working with some really sensitive populations, and this can be even more important. And I know that anonymity and confidentiality is important to a lot of lawyers. So how we frame and how we talk about the survey is also really important. So letting people know that, our goal here is to improve services. Our goal here is to better understand our community members. You know, we let them know that we're going to let them know what we heard. And then it's really important, if you're going to tell people that we're going to close the loop with you, that you actually do it. It's really important to be clear when data is confidential or when data is anonymous and how people are going to have access to the data. We've worked with some legal aid organizations where anonymous surveying was not the approach they wanted to take. They wanted to do confidential surveying, mostly so that if something came up in a survey that they needed to respond to, they'd be able to go back to a client and actually, if something surfaced in the data, they wanted to be able to go back and check in with the client. So when you are choosing to do confidential, so we always recommend anonymous when you can, but when you're doing confidential surveying, it's really important to think through the process of how you're going to maintain confidentiality, but also how you're letting the clients know about that confidentiality. Always letting them, know that you understand that there's a power imbalance here and that there's no consequences to even critical feedback. And whenever possible, if you can engage, if you're doing a client survey, if you can engage other clients in the process, if you're doing a volunteer survey, engaging other volunteers in the process, that can really help refine the way that you do it. Similar to how Mattapan did the pilot first, right? And they could get feedback on if is the survey actually working before they rolled it out. That engaging people in that process really helps you ensure that you have a really good version of it. I know I always get questions about like, well, how should we get feedback? And there's so many ways that you can do it. Listen for Good is a surveying organization. That's really what we focus on. Um, but it's not the only way that you can get feedback. When you're looking at smaller groups of people, you can do it through focus groups and through interviews. Um, but also, what works really well in conjunction with things like surveys is other structures of community, integrating community voice. So building structures of advisory committees can also be a really great way of helping to incorporate community voice, and they help support your survey development. So they all really do work hand in hand. Once we have that data, it's all about how are we interpreting that data. And here it's really about how are we disaggregating the data in order to identify patterns. So disaggregation and segmentation is really important. One of the reasons why um, especially in anonymous surveying, we always include demographic questions are so that we can segment data effectively by demographics. I'll give you an example of one organization. This is a youth serving organization. They serve predominantly white and Hispanic families because they're in the Southwest. And when they did their survey, it looked actually it looked pretty good in the aggregate. And it was only when they disaggregated by race and ethnicity that they saw that their Black and multiracial families were having a very different experience. They felt less connected to staff. They were less likely to feel like their needs were being met, less likely to feel like their voice was being heard. And so it's really about thinking through who is it that you serve and what could be salient to your population. For this organization, they saw that race and ethnicity was having an impact. And so they built their intervention, they built their response around how do we make sure that our Black and multiracial families are feeling welcomed. And so this is one of the ways that we can really bring up some actions to take. So maybe race and ethnicity is the salient thing for your community members, but maybe it's gender, maybe it's language spoken, maybe it's neighborhood. Lots of ways that you can think about who is it that you're serving, who is it that you're working with. When you're doing a staff survey, for example, maybe it's about roles that people have. But how can you really break down the data and look at different audiences to really ensure that everybody is having the experience that you want them to have? I'm going to share a couple of things then. When it comes to closing the loop, right? I mentioned we do this so that we can actually do something with the data and so that we can actually share back because sharing back is what builds the relationships and what builds the trust with our community members. And I'm so glad I included this slide because the truth is, it is the last step or the step four is the hardest step to do. Um, and sometimes that's because of what we've taken from actually student feedback, what they call the 4Ds, right? We find that oftentimes it can be difficult to have staff and colleagues respond to data and respond to feedback in a positive, actionable way. So there are a couple of things to be aware of, right? And this is why the way we present data and the way we bring people on board can be really important. We find that sometimes colleagues can feel defensive, and this is something that a lot of people feel throughout the feedback process, especially when you're gathering client feedback. And people are concerned that the feedback is going to come back and it's going to be used against them. And so they're going to look for ways to like defend their position. They're going to look for ways to deflect the reasons why feedback data. I will say that a lot of this comes from fear of the unknown and not knowing what the data is going to say. The truth is, a lot of our organizations are doing really good work. And once you see the data, a lot of it validates the work that you're doing. So sometimes it's really positive there as well. But, it's also easy. People might be dismissive, questioning the methodology, just the validity of the findings overall. And, sometimes that might be legitimate. It is hard to do high quality surveying, but sometimes it'll really be about being able to validate our approach and why we made decisions we made. It could just result in people feeling dejected and ultimately really downplaying the steps that we need to take. So I mention this because it's something to be aware of as you're building in the process. So thinking about how can you bring people on board from the beginning, how can you include them, and how do you present and communicate findings in order to help maybe mitigate some of these factors. Um, dealing with the organizational change piece of it is not always going to be a challenge, but it often can be. And when it comes to closing the loop, it's really the best practice here is just to do it. Here's an example of how Open Door Legal, who hear from a lot of clients, they have it on their website. So they have regular ongoing feedback and they have metrics that they just keep on their website that they publish regularly that people can always see. It helps community members know they're being listened to. It gives examples, has really great quotes. And so they use it for their community members to feel validated. But what it also helps with is letting others in the community know. It helps, lets donors know, right? Funders know that we do listen to our community members, and this is really what we're building up upon. So closing the loop is something that is really powerful and something that we have to do when it comes to those who took the survey, but it also really helps benefit the community at large to let people know, hey, we're a listening organization and we're taking these people's voices seriously. We're going to take your voice seriously as well. So I know I've been talking a lot about you, a lot to you. Hopefully this included some tips. I'm gonna give you just like a really quick run through of who we are, why we've been talking, but then I'm going to open it to questions. But Listen for Good, we have capacity buildings that help organizations do this work. Uh, we we have been working across the country with a little over 1,200 organizations. We've been working with about 50 public safety and legal aid organizations across the country. This is one of the sectors that we're really growing a lot in our partnership. We offer three main pillars of support. We offer an online self-guided tool that helps you build out your surveys and put everything, all of your tools and resources in one place. We have opportunities to learn alongside other organizations who are doing this work, and we have coaches that help you do it. We do this through an 18-month self-paced program. So you start either in July or you start in January. You go through the whole process of building out a survey with our partnership. You work on a pace that your own pace. Um, but we've structured it to be 18 months so that we can really partner with you um, uh, and help you build this muscle over multiple loops. We offer two programs to get started. We have a premium program where a coach works step by step with you, and then we have another program where it's a little more self-directed with a little bit fewer coach hours. But ultimately, we're partnering with you every single step of the way, and it's something you can opt in to pay for, but we have pretty good. We've been building funder relationships across the country and here in California in particular. And so we're always happy to try to partner, see if we have any funding partners that we can actually have them sponsor your participation. The majority of organizations don't pay for Listen for Good themselves. We partner with a funder. If any of this sounded interesting and you want to join our program, our next program does start in July, and their registration deadline is coming up on June 1st for that. So we will share this, but I just want to open it up now to questions. I know there was a hand earlier. You can throw your questions in the chat over the next few minutes. What has come up for you? Rachel, I think you can go ahead and unmute
Question.
yourself.
I am also someone who frequently receives and frequently ignores surveys, whether it's with
Yep.
MCLE or occasionally from partner organizations. And
Yeah.
so the idea is like, how do we create surveys that um, are accessible to,
Mhm.
particularly clients and staff? I think all of us, we don't have a lot of time in our day, and the
Yep.
idea of giving feedback um, and particularly in circumstances where we may or may not think that it's going to be relevant,
Yeah.
is definitely a challenge. And then coupled with that is making sure that we don't just get a feedback bias from
Yep.
either the happiest or the most unhappy clients
Yep.
or staff.
Yep. So how do you do all that? Um,
Everything. Yes.
yeah. How do we do this? No, you're right. And this is sometimes why your first feedback loop is not your strongest feedback loop, but you have to start somewhere. The messaging, so there's a couple of things. The messaging can be really helpful here. If you can kind of do what there's an official term that we have for it. I can't remember what it is. It's kind of like closing the loop forward. So it's when you say, the last time we gathered feedback, here's what we heard and here's what we did with it. Now we'd like you to share your thoughts. That helps, right? Because it lets people know up front that you've already done this. You already listen. You already proven that you listen. My voice isn't going to go into a black hole. Now I have something to say. So there's like that. The technical part also helps. We know that things like electronic surveying, as far as like text messages and emails, do tend to have lower response rates than in-person surveys. You know, I come from the youth development world where I would have a training of young people and I can hand out a survey and I can make sure they give it to me before they leave. That's an easy way to make sure I'm getting responses. Now, though, when you're texting people, you're emailing them, you have to think about what's going to motivate them to actually open the email or click on the link. So the process of like what's realistic? Can we send an email and then send a follow-up text? Open Door Legal actually has a very impressive policy where or process in place where they have automated text messages that go out. They serve like a big population. So automated text messages will go out when like a I don't want to get the legal terms here, but I think they do it when the case has closed with a client. They get an automated text message. But then in the summers, they have an intern that goes through who haven't they heard from, and they call them and they do the survey over the phone, right? So like it's always like a combination of what are the low lift things, sending a text message, versus what are the higher lift things, like calling people, which takes a lot of capacity. And how can you balance those things to ensure a high response rate? In a similar vein, actually, a lot of the times what people do is they send out the survey and then they close the survey and there's nothing in between, but monitoring responses and then being willing to change your process of how are we gathering responses in the middle of the process if it's not working is important. So knowing that we serve, you know, if you serve a, let's say, a diverse community and you see in the process that your data is coming in from women, but you're not hearing from men, that means you need to actually try to over survey men, right? You're going to need to actually focus on hearing from them so that you can have a representative response. So there's a lot there in like how do we build this muscle of being responsive and like trying things and seeing what works. That's how we get people to take the survey. There was a second part of that question. What did I miss?
Um, well, part of it was, I think, like something that is accessible to folks, that folks will respond to, and then the other part was the bias
Yeah.
or like response bias. So you've addressed it, I think. I
Yeah, the
appreciate
only
it.
other thing that I'll mention is that who asks, like relationships really matter in response rates. And so if it comes from somebody they know, that helps increase response rate. But then you also really want to be careful when it comes to bias. So thinking through how do you balance those things can be really important. Suzanne, you ask a question. Oh, yeah, that's not a question. That's a comment. Thank you for that. We find that internally we have strong survey participation when our staff understands what has been the outcome of our prior surveying. They know that when they give us their voice, the tangible changes that are highly communicated that follows. Absolutely. That is a really good example of how closing the loop. And what we find is that organizations who are consistent about closing the loop over time have higher response rates. And exactly because of this, because you know that they've done it in the past, they're going to continue to listen to our voice. We will be sharing out the slides, and in the follow-up, you'll have my contact info as well. So if there are any additional questions, I really, please do not hesitate to reach out to me, ask me questions. They could be particular questions, they could be broad questions. I can send you resources. Please do reach out with anything you're thinking through. And if you are, you know, interested in partnering with Listen for Good in the future, let me know. We're always happy to start having those conversations about future sponsorships or engaging in different ways. LAC team, have I missed anything? Well, thank you all so much for joining.